Welcome to another episode of Ask Skill Builder. It's going really well. We're getting loads of questions coming in, so thanks very much and keep them coming. Okay, so the next question we got a little, goodness me, look at this. This is from Don, and Don said he's building an extension. He's doing all the work himself because he can't afford anybody. That's fine. And he's discovered what he says is a cesspit. I'm not even sure it's a cesspit, really. Looking at the picture, Don, I'm just thinking, is this a cesspit or is this just where a drain has washed away some ground? Because it'd be very unusual to put a cesspit just that close to a building. It needs some investigation. It's one of those things you've got to do, and you've got to do properly, because at some point the building inspector is going to come round and he's going to look at the trench, he's going to see the hole. So what I would do is I'd book an inspection to get them round, let them have a look at it and ask them what they think. Now, I found a very similar thing in the corner of a house that I was building an extension on, and it was actually a well, 150 years old, the well. The building inspector said, that's fine, just fill it full of rubble, put a bit of polythene over the top of the rubble, float a bit of concrete over that, then put some beams. You can get pre-stressed concrete beams, ground beams, that kind of thing. Stick a couple of those in so that they bridge the old well from side to side. He said, then when you pour the concrete, you've got a bridge over that. Now, it was only a single story extensions and it was lightweight construction, so it was never going to put that much of a load on it, but it was on the corner, which is always the worst place to have these. But by straddling it, by extending the foundation out beyond where it needed to be, I was able to bridge it. So it's not going to be a job you're going to do without some kind of approval or intervention from them, so the best time to get them in is now. The worst thing is to do a load of work and then they come around and they say, that's not any good, that's not what we want, so you've got to do it again. So always ask first. Okay, so now we've got a question from Alex, and Alex has got a new porch. What he's got is water ingress. He lives on the coast. He's got the wind blowing in and it's bringing the rain in. He's getting leaks all round. Now, he said the builder's come back. The builder's very good. He said he's a very obliging guy, keeps coming back, keeps trying to solve it. He said he's used a ton of silicone sealant in there and it still hasn't solved the problem. So I think perhaps it's time to stop using that silicone sealant. If I look at this, if we look at the pictures closely, we can see down the edge there where the UPVC joins the existing render. You can see the gap is quite large there, and sometimes that's a little bit too much for the silicone to do. And the big problem you've got there is that even if it does it in the initial stages, if there's not enough expansion and contraction in that silicone, it's going to pull away, it's going to tear down. It's not always a great thing when you try and stick it onto render. It doesn't always work. It's one of those things where you want to use a low modulus neutral curing silicone on there, and that means that you've got a better chance. But what we used to do a lot, which tends to have gone out of fashion now, is we used to put a foam backing strip onto windows. When we fitted windows or doors, you would use this stuff, which was just like a bit of round foam, and you would push that in first, and then the window would sit against that, and that gave you something to silicone too. Because at the moment, what he's trying to do is he's trying to squirt silicone into fresh air, so it's just bridging the gap. These days, people are using a lot of foam. They're using the gun foam, and they squirt all the way down with the gun foam, trim it back with a knife, and then run the silicone in. So that's another way of doing it, but I prefer the actual strips of foam that you can buy to do the job. This is for a foam strip for passive house use. Now, these are used nowadays because we're worried about air leakage. If you're trying to achieve a very, very low carbon rating on your house, you use all these things to make it airtight. And this is one of the things that cuts down on the drafts around the window, and you put that in first before you put the window in. Then, if the silicone breaks down, you've still got this lovely squashy foam, which is a kind of self-expanding foam, if you like. Once you put it in there, it just carries on growing until it fills the gap. It's very clever. And if you use that, then you've got a better chance. But of course, he's done the job now, so he probably won't want to take that frame out, although it doesn't look like a huge job to do it. So maybe the gun foam is the way to go with this. Foam it first, then silicone it. Now, the other thing I'm looking at is at the bottom here, you've got some ingress coming in, and I reckon that's just blowing underneath. and it looks like he's stuck this straight onto the ground. So what I would like to see there is that frame lifted off the ground slightly, put a piece of damp-proof course under the frame and up the back, lap it up the back of the frame, so that when the floor covering goes on the inside, I'm assuming you put tiles in there or some kind of screed in there, which just raises it up slightly. You've actually got a little lip there, and the water, if the water blows in, it won't blow in and then climb up and over. So at the moment it's just blowing straight under. So he's not going to solve it with silicone, because the silicone just will not last in that situation. So basically a day's work for him to take those frames out, put his damp-proof course in, put a bit of foam in there and redo it. And then the other thing I must say is weep holes. A lot of frames have weep holes at the bottom, so that if any water gets into the frame itself, you need it to drain out. Now, sometimes well-meaning people go round, they see a hole in the frame and they fill it full of silicone or something like that, which means that the frame is effectively flooding. As it rains, the water is building up inside the frame, and you sometimes see it squirting out in a little jet. So you've got to look at the holes and think about why the holes are there. But I think what I would do, if this was my job and I had this kind of problem, I'd go and get myself a pressure washer, I'd go around there and I would blast it. In fact, I'd probably get the householder to blast it while I was on the inside having a very, very careful look at where that water's coming in. So we've got a question here from Dave, who came through on Facebook, and if you want to use Facebook, by the way, you can do that. You can contact us in other ways. So Dave, he's actually in the trade, and he's saying he really just wants a bit of a second opinion. And thanks very much for all the nice things he said about the channel, Dave, because that's really nice. We get a lot of abuse one way or another, and it's nice to get a bit of love coming through every so often. So thanks for that, mate. That really cheers us up. So what he's saying is there a pump? Can I recommend a pump that can use on a gravity hot water system that will boost the shower but doesn't require a flange to be used? Now, so just to show you what a flange is, here we are. This one's the Surrey flange. There's also an Essex flange, which I think is an inferior product. No, this isn't a war. The Essex flange requires you to cut a hole in the side of the cylinder and then poke this thing through and so on, and I tend not to like them, because who wants to cut a hole in the side of a cylinder? The Surrey flange works by taking out the top connection from the cylinder and poking this thing in, and that gives you two separate drawer offs. If you see that dip pipe that goes down there from the flange, that is for the pumped connection, and what it's doing is it's sucking water from inside the cylinder so that you don't get air coming in. So when you turn the pump on, you're not getting spluttering because it's sucking air in. It's a great invention, that, but it does require you to have a 1-inch connection on the top of the cylinder, and the trouble with a lot of modern cylinders is they don't have a 1-inch connection, they have a 3/4-inch connection, which doesn't leave you enough room to get that Surrey flange in there. So bit of a shame, that, because they just sort of cut down on it a bit. Now, what I would say is that there's two things here, Dave. One is that if you've got a good cold supply to the cylinder, and I'm talking about 28mm feed rather than the 22mm feed, it keeps the water coming in, because the only way that you're getting air into the pump is because the water that's coming into the cylinder isn't coming in as fast as the water you're sucking out through the pump. If you can increase the flow into the cylinder, it helps the situation enormously. If you do that, you can very often go from the horizontal connection on the cylinder where the pipe comes across. You can usually tee into that. Now, when you tee into that, it's important that that tee goes down first rather than up. So if you eventually want to have that going up into the loft, say, you must make it go down first, then you can do a little turn, say take it down a foot, 300mm, that sort of thing, and then you can turn it up and go upwards. But the idea of that is that it will stop that air being sucked in, because as the air is sucked in, the fact that it's rising all the time means that the air will bubble back up and up the vent pipe. So it helps. You could even take that connection right down to the base of the cylinder and then go up to the top, and in that situation, for it to suck air in through the vent pipe would be a huge task for it. So I would try that first, because I've done that on many occasions, and it's worked out fine. I've had no trouble at all with air coming in, what they call cavitation. Best thing is if you can put the pump in low down, you put the pump in around the base of the cylinder, it's keeping it flooded completely, so that will also help the situation rather than putting the pump up in the loft. So that means you've got to run your cold supply from your tank down into the airing cupboard, into the pump, then back out to the shower, and you've also got to run your hot supply into the pump. Now, in terms of which pump to use, he said, can I recommend a pump? There's a new one from Salamander, which I think is fantastic. So have a look at that. It's an intelligent pump, shower pump, so I think it's a good bet. But Stuart Turner, great pumps. There's any number of pumps out there which are good for the job, and of course they tend to cost a lot of money actually, so if you shop around you will find that you can pick up a good Stuart Turner for around about 130 quid, that kind of money, but not much less than that.
I've got a Salamander pump. Dave can have that, can't he?
Good do, if you want to get rid of it. Yeah,
I can give it to Dave. I'll send you a Salamander pump. We don't give them to everybody though.
Doesn't work, Dave. We got a little plumbing problem right up my street. This is from Matt Gillham. Now Matt has purchased what he calls a fully enclosed toilet. Now I think what he's talking about is a back to the wall pan, which means that you can't see the soil pipe that's behind the pan. And what he's wondering is how he can get the pan and the soil pipe connected, given the fact that he's got to connect them first and then push them back to the wall. Well, Matt, this is where the plumber becomes worth his money. And I have to say that I did a job some years ago from somebody who'd picked up a pan from the Ideal Home show on the last day, and they brought it back and they wanted me to fit it. I fitted it, pushed it back, leaked, pulled it out, played around with it, pushed it back, leaked, and I spent a good half day playing around with this pan. Then I looked at the spigot on it, and on the back of the spigot it was oval, it wasn't actually a round spigot, so it was never going to make a good seal on there, so I ended up with Jubilee clips and all sorts. So it can be tricky, but if you've got a nice round spigot and you can just measure where it's going to go, and then you get yourself a P-trap connector which is going to go down into that pipe there that you've shown us, and the P-trap pan connector, if you need to get that pan back further to the wall, in other words that pipe is slightly too far forward, you can get what I call a question mark pan connector, which is like the P but it goes back slightly out. That allows you to push that pan back beyond that pipe in the floor, which is a very handy little invention. You have to line everything up. You have to just measure things, you have to steady that pan connector, and you have to just push that pan back into place, holding the pan connector with your hands until the last minute. And it helps to put something behind the pan connector, between the pan connector and the wall, so that it's got nowhere to push against. So you can do that with a piece of board or something else, piece of wood or anything you like, just to get something to stop it flexing at that point. And then maybe you need a little bit of lubricant around that pan connector just to push it in, just to get it to pop in. We don't generally like that because it also makes them pop off. The other alternative, which I don't favour, but you can do if you really get stuck, is to use a flexible connector. Now the problem with the flexible connectors is they don't give you always a smooth run. If you put the flexi connector onto the pan and into the soil pipe and then you push it back, you don't really know whether that's been distorted or trapped in there in some way and is being restricted. But if you could kind of reduce the height of the soil pipe coming out of the floor slightly, the flexi connector's a better bet. But have a look at them in the catalogue. It may well be that you've got to go and buy a flexi connector and you've got to buy yourself a P-trap pan connector, and you've got to have a look at them and see which one fits best. And then if you haven't unwrapped it, you can take the other one back to the plumbers merchants when you've finished. So here's a question from Richard Pace. He's doing a wet room. Hello, Richard. And he says when he's doing the corners, he knows all about, using the elements board. He's doing all that, and he's going to tape the joints up. And he's saying when he's doing the corners of a tiling, should he use silicone joint there or should he use grout? The silicone joint is a more flexible joint, so if you've got any differential movement between those two walls, the silicone joint will cope with it better, whereas the grout will crack. So the only trouble is with the silicone is it does tend to collect mould, and we have a video on how to get rid of that mould in those situations, but that's why some people prefer just to use the grout in the corner. But ordinarily, if you were using the grout and got through, and it takes a tiny crack and the water tracks through, it's amazing the way it tracks through, and it got behind the tiles, then it could start to do damage if it was on plasterboard. But because you've got elements board, you've got that second layer of protection behind there, so it's never going to get through the tape and the elements board. So even if you've got a tiny little bit of water tracking through, it wouldn't do any harm. So really, you've got the choice of using the grout or the silicone in that situation. The silicone's going to work better, but the silicone you're going to have to renew more often or clean more often than you do the grout. So if you've got a nice little joint, here's an idea. Why don't you leave that 2mm gap or whatever your tile spacing is down the edge where the corner is, rather than butt those tiles right up. Then squirt a little bit of silicone into the joint there, and then just rake it slightly back with something like a tile spacer, just to give you a little bit of something to go with. And then when you grout the tiles, just grout into the corner. That way you're going to have grout on top of silicone, and then behind that you're going to have the elements board and the tape and everything else. So that's 3 ways of protecting you from water, which I think is great. Okay,